Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, where we uncover the darkest stories hidden in the shadows. Amid the verdant embrace of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where mist clings to ancient pines like spectral fingers, there once stood a cabin that whispered secrets into the Carolina wind. The year was 1859, when the nation teetered on the precipice of fraternal bloodshed. Yet in this remote corner of North Carolina, a different kind of darkness flourished, one that would remain shrouded in hushed tones for generations. The McLaren property occupied a forgotten hollow where sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy overhead. Local legend claims that even in high summer, the clearing where the cabin stood received but 3 hours of direct light, as if the heavens themselves were reluctant to illuminate what transpired there. The cabin was constructed of chestnut logs, harvested before the blight would later decimate these arboreal giants, their weathered surfaces blackened by decades of wood smoke and something else that locals could never quite name. The path leading to the McLaren homestead meandered through a section of forest where birds seldom sang. Travelers reported an oppressive silence that descended upon them half a mile before reaching the property, a preternatural hush that made men instinctively lower their voices to whispers, though they could not articulate why. Augustus McLaren acquired the land in 1843, paying a sum so meager that courthouse records suggest the previous owner was desperate to divest himself of the property. A Scottish immigrant with calloused hands and eyes that never quite met those of his interlocutors, McLaren arrived with a wife whose face remained perpetually obscured by a bonnet of unusual design, even indoors during social gatherings. What little commerce the McLarens conducted with the nearest town of Willow Creek was handled exclusively by Augustus. His purchases were peculiar, quantities of cloth disproportionate to a family supposedly consisting of just 2 adults, bushels of food that suggested numerous mouths to feed, yet no children were ever registered in the county census or church baptismal records. The first whispers began in 1851, when a hunting party tracking a wounded deer strayed closer to the McLaren property than local custom advised. From beyond the tree line, they reported hearing children's voices, not in play, but reciting something in unison, their words indecipherable, but their cadence unmistakably ritualistic. When questioned about family, McLaren would smile thinly and offer only that, "The good Lord has blessed us in ways beyond counting." It was Eliza Thornfield, midwife to 3 counties, who first spoke of the children without names. Summoned on a stormy autumn night in 1857 when Mrs. McLaren was reportedly in a difficult labor, Eliza found not one expectant mother, but evidence of multiple children already in residence. Small handprints pressed into the clay, chinking between logs, tiny garments hanging to dry, beds piled with straw, ticking in a room hidden behind a false wall. Yet no names were carved on the modest wooden toys, no monikers called out in instruction or affection. "They don't call them anything at all," Eliza confided to the Methodist minister's wife. "Those children exist without the dignity of names, as if denying them the very thing that would make them fully human in the eyes of God." The revelation from Eliza Thornfield spread through Willow Creek with the insidious persistence of morning fog, settling into the valleys of conversation at quilting circles and corn huskings. By the winter of 1858, the McLaren homestead had transformed in local imagination from merely peculiar to something altogether more sinister, a transformation accelerated by the disappearance of young Timothy Walsh that December. Timothy, a boy of 12 years with copper-colored hair and a constellation of freckles across his nose, vanished while collecting winterberries along the northern periphery of McLaren land. The search party, comprised of 37 men bearing tallow lanterns and loaded rifles, stopped short of breaching the property line, their courage faltering not from any legal concern, but from something more primeval, a dread that seeped from the soil itself. Sheriff Caleb Montgomery, a veteran of the Mexican War who had faced the thundering cannons at Buena Vista without flinching, approached the cabin alone. He returned ashen-faced, reporting that Augustus McLaren had been most accommodating in permitting a cursory inspection of the premises. The sheriff found no trace of the Walsh boy, but noted with uncharacteristic reticence that the interior of the cabin seemed vastly more extensive than its outer dimensions would suggest, with passages that turned at angles that confounded the senses. That winter proved unusually harsh. with ice storms entombing the Blue Ridge in crystalline silence. Travelers along the post road reported hearing a chorus of childish voices emanating from the McLaren Hollow during the longest nights, not the boisterous play of youth, but something measured and methodical, like the recitation of catechism without the comfort of faith behind it. The regional newspaper, the Willow Creek Gazette, made oblique reference to the matter in its February edition, couching concerns in the euphemistic language of the day. Certain remote homesteads might benefit from greater integration into our Christian community, lest isolation breed practices at variance with civilized custom. Those who could read between the lines understood the true import of this statement, while Augustus McLaren, who collected his mail monthly, appeared at the general store the following day, smiling placidly as he purchased 3 additional bolts of unbleached muslin. As spring approached, Reverend Thaddeus Whitaker felt compelled by Christian duty to make a pastoral call upon the McLaren household. His diary entry of March 10, 1859, discovered decades later secreted behind a loose brick in the church foundation, described a scene of profound disquiet. The children emerged from the shadows of that benighted dwelling like pale shoots denied proper sunlight. I counted 7 distinct souls, though I sensed others lurking beyond my sight. They arranged themselves in a perfect crescent before me, their movements possessed of an uncanny synchronicity. When I asked their names to offer individual blessing, the eldest, a girl of perhaps 14 summers with eyes like deep wells, responded, "We require no names here, Reverend. He knows us by our numbers and our purpose." The Reverend departed before nightfall, leaving his silver pocket Bible behind in his haste. He would later claim this abandonment was deliberate, a talisman against whatever grew in that hollow. Within a fortnight he had tendered his resignation and departed for a parish in Tennessee, his once robust faith apparently shaken to its foundations. By early April, peculiar fungi began sprouting in concentric rings around the McLaren property, their caps an unnatural shade of violet that no local forager could identify. Harriet Crowley, the county's most knowledgeable herbalist, refused to even touch them, claiming they exuded a scent reminiscent of amniotic fluid mingled with grave dirt. Children who ventured near these fungal circles reported dreams of suffocation and confinement for nights afterward. When summer arrived with unusual swiftness that year, Willow Creek's inhabitants noticed a change in Augustus McLaren's demeanor. His once furtive visits to town took on an air of brazen confidence. He now stood straight-backed at 6 feet 2 inches, his formerly hunched shoulders thrown back with peculiar pride. His beard, once unkempt and streaked with premature gray, appeared suddenly lustrous and black as coal. Most unsettling were his eyes. Previously downcast and evasive, they now surveyed the townsfolk with predatory assessment, the pale blue irises seemingly enlarged until the whites were barely visible. "There's something feeding that man," whispered Eleanor Simmons, the postmaster's wife, after McLaren collected a mysterious parcel bearing no return address. "And I'll wager my mother's silver it ain't any sustenance God intended for his children." The package in question had arrived wrapped in oilcloth of foreign manufacture, sealed with red wax impressed with a symbol resembling an inverted tree. When questioned about its contents, McLaren merely smiled, revealing teeth that several witnesses later independently described as too numerous and sharply pointed for Christian comfort. In late June, Magistrate William Preston received an anonymous letter detailing concerns about the McLaren household. As the highest legal authority within 3 counties and a man whose shock of white hair and impressive mutton chops lent him a gravitas beyond his 57 years, Preston approached his duties with methodical thoroughness. His leather-bound notebook, recovered from the ashes of what would later transpire, contained meticulous observations from his unannounced visit to the property on June 29th. "The children move with an unnatural fluidity," Preston wrote in his precise copperplate hand. "Their limbs seem double-jointed, their necks capable of rotation beyond normal human limits. When they gathered to observe me from the shadows, I noted their breathing synchronized perfectly, chests rising and falling as one organism rather than individual beings." Most disturbing was Preston's description of the infant he glimpsed momentarily before Mrs. McLaren whisked it from view, a child whose skin bore a pattern that he likened to the whorls of wood grain, and whose eyes, though those of a babe no more than 6 months old held an awareness that chilled him to the marrow. Preston's final notation simply read, "The cellar door. God help me, the sounds from beneath." The remainder of the page was blank save for a dark smudge that laboratory analysis conducted in 1973 would confirm was not ink, but blood of human origin. The first week of July arrived with a peculiar heaviness to the air, as if the atmosphere itself had grown viscous and resistant to mortal breath. Magistrate Preston's disappearance provoked little immediate alarm. The man was known to embark on extended legal consultations in neighboring counties. Only when his horse returned riderless, its flanks lathered with exertion and eyes rolling in mute terror, did the townsfolk of Willow Creek acknowledge the dreadful possibility that the McLaren property had claimed another soul. Sheriff Montgomery organized a delegation of 12 men, fortified with both ammunition and sacramental wine from Father Donovan's personal reserve. As they approached the hollow, a miasma descended upon them. Not fog from the mountains, but something more substantive, carrying a scent that the butcher among them likened to the sweet putrefaction of meat gone peculiarly wrong. 3 men turned back before reaching the property line, overcome by violent nausea and visions of crawling shapes at the periphery of their sight. The remaining 9 discovered the McLaren Cabin apparently abandoned, the door swinging idly on leather hinges, creaking a doleful welcome with each errant breeze. Inside, they found evidence of hasty departure. Half-consumed bowls of porridge, their surfaces filmed with opalescent mold that seemed to pulse rhythmically. A spinning wheel still in lazy motion, though no hand had touched it for days. And most disturbingly, tiny footprints visible in the dust, leading not toward the exit, but directly into the solid stone of the hearth. In the sleeping chamber, Sheriff Montgomery discovered a ledger bound in material that none of the men would consent to touch. Within its pages, written in a cramped hand that changed subtly every 7th entry, they found not names, but designations. Vessel 3 showing promising elasticity of form. Vessel 8 rejected, insufficient cranial capacity. Vessel 12 exceeding expectations, vocalization now encompasses tones beyond human registry. The cellar door, the subject of Preston's final ominous notation, was secured with 7 locks of different manufacture. After considerable effort, the delegation succeeded in breaking it open, only to find the stairs descended far deeper than any proper root cellar should. Calvin Mercer, a stonemason by trade, remarked that the passageway extended well beyond the natural bedrock, requiring excavation expertise the McLarens could not possibly possess. Descending by lantern light, the men followed the passage until it opened into a circular chamber some 30 feet in diameter. The walls were inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly, resolving into familiar shapes only when glimpsed from the corner of one's eye. At the center stood a stone table, its surface concave and stained with substances that had seeped deeply into the porous rock. Sheriff Montgomery approached the table and discovered within its shallow basin a single object, a child's tooth, unremarkable save for the fact that it appeared to be growing minute tendrils that writhed with purposeful motion. When Ezekiel Turner, the blacksmith, brought his lantern closer for inspection, the men observed with collective horror that the tooth cast 7 distinct shadows, each pointing toward a different carving on the chamber walls. The most terrible discovery came when Joshua Parker, stepping backward in revulsion, disturbed the packed earth of the floor. A small avalanche of soil revealed what appeared to be countless finger bones, some adult-sized, but most distressingly small, interlocked in concentric patterns beneath their feet, extending outward from the central table like the spokes of an unholy wheel. The men fled that blasphemous chamber, their lungs burning with air that grew increasingly sulphurous as they ascended. By midnight they had gathered at Willow Creek's town hall, their testimonies recorded by Judge Harlan Blackwood's trembling hand. None would return to their homes alone that night, for each man swore the same disturbing account, that childlike voices had followed them from the hollow, whispering numbers rather than pleas at their backs. The following dawn brought an unseasonable fog that clung to Willow Creek for 7 consecutive days. During this period, livestock throughout the county suffered mysterious afflictions. Cow's milk turned to a substance resembling thin gray clay, and chickens laid eggs with translucent shells through which pulsating dark masses could be observed. Harriet Crowley, sequestered in her cottage brewing protective tinctures, documented observations in her herbal journal. July 9, 1859. The McLaren contagion spreads. 3 children in town exhibit peculiar symptoms: elongation of the fingers, nocturnal humming in perfect unison despite being housed in separate dwellings, and an alarming tendency to arrange household objects in spiral patterns when left unsupervised. I have administered foxglove and monkshood in careful measure, not to cure but to sedate. What incubates within them requires more potent intervention than mere herbcraft can provide. A letter discovered within the church poor box, unsigned but bearing a distinctive script, later identified as belonging to Mrs. McLaren, offered the only explanation from those who had orchestrated the abomination. To those who seek understanding where none should be granted, the vessels you call children were never yours to name or claim. They belong to what waits below, as receptacles for fragments of that which must be reassembled. Each child without a name creates a hollow space where something ancient may take residence. We have prepared 17 vessels. The 18th will complete the circle. Look to your own broods, count carefully, and watch for the signs of substitution. By mid-July, Sheriff Montgomery organized a second expedition, this time accompanied by Father Donovan bearing sacred implements. They intended to burn the McLaren Cabin to its foundation, but nature had seemingly anticipated their purpose. A lightning strike during the previous night's storm had ignited the structure, reducing it to smoldering ruins. Yet the blaze had revealed something more horrifying. Beneath the cabin's footprint lay exposed an intricate network of tunnels, their openings reminiscent of a massive honeycomb scaled for human passage. Samuel Cooper, the county surveyor, attempted to map these passages before they could be filled. His efforts ended abruptly when his measuring line, dropped into a central shaft, continued unspooling to a depth of over 400 feet before the tension suddenly slackened. When withdrawn, the final 6 feet of rope had been transformed into a substance resembling sinew, still quivering with independent movement. The expedition made one final terrible discovery in the burnt remnants of what had been the McLaren pantry. A jar containing preserved umbilical cords, 17 in number, each labeled not with dates or names, but with numeric designations. Father Donovan observed with mounting dread that the specimens appeared fresh despite the McLaren's 16-year residence, and more disturbingly, that each cord possessed an additional vestigial branch not present in natural human anatomy. The town of Willow Creek convened an emergency council on the 20th of July, gathering in the sweltering heat of the Methodist Church, as no one would consent to meet in the town hall after dark. Elder families brought forth dusty tomes and yellowed correspondence suggesting the McLaren Hollow had harbored malevolence long before Augustus staked his claim. Obadiah Jenkins, whose lineage stretched back to the original settlement, produced a fragile journal kept by his great-grandfather detailing an encounter in 1793 with a nomadic tribe who refused to hunt within 5 miles of that particular depression in the mountains. They called it the place where children become vessels, Jenkins read, his voice quavering as he translated the phonetic approximation of the indigenous language. Their shamans marked the boundaries with warnings our settlers mistook for decorative carvings on the sycamores. Examination of county archives revealed a disturbing pattern. The McLaren property had changed hands 7 times since initial settlement, each transfer occurring after precisely 16 years of ownership. More troubling still, each previous owner had arrived with no children and departed with several, though no births were ever registered. The records showed the same purchase price repeated across decades without adjustment for inflation. 17 silver dollars and a portion of flesh, described as personal consideration. Dr. Ambrose Whitaker, who had maintained medical records for the region since 1838, presented evidence of subtle anatomical anomalies in children who had resided near the property. His clinical notes documented elongation of the final phalanges, unusual elasticity of the orbital sockets, and secondary palates developing after normal dental maturation. Most concerning were his observations of cranial sutures that remained unsealed well into adolescence, as if the skull were designed to accommodate something expanding within. I believe, the doctor stated, removing his spectacles with trembling fingers, that what we witnessed was merely preparation. The children without names were being modified to house something that cannot naturally inhabit human form. The council commissioned a detailed survey of Willow Creek's population, discovering with mounting horror that 17 children had vanished from surrounding farms and homesteads over the previous 16 years. Each disappearance attributed to accident, illness, or presumed flight, yet collectively forming a pattern no individual family had detected. More disturbing were the 17 children who had seemingly appeared during the same period, integrated into different households through what families had believed were legitimate adoptions arranged through distant orphanages that, upon investigation, proved non-existent. Ezekiel Turner, the blacksmith whose own daughter had died and been buried 6 winters prior, demanded the unthinkable: exhumation of the small graves in the churchyard. The grim work, conducted under Father Donovan's anguished supervision, revealed 13 coffins filled with river stones wrapped in burial shrouds, their weight approximating that of the children supposedly interred within. 4 graves contained something more horrifying: homunculi crafted from clay, twigs, and animal sinew, their crude forms bound with human hair, eyes replaced with smooth river stones engraved with the same symbols found in the McLaren cellar. As night descended, the 13 bereaved families gathered in silent vigil, their lanterns forming a protective constellation around Willow Creek. Beyond the light's reach, in the darkness of the surrounding forest, 13 childlike figures were observed standing motionless at intervals precisely 17 paces apart, their faces turned toward the hollow where the McLaren Cabin had stood, awaiting the final vessel that would complete their circle. The search for the 18th vessel consumed Willow Creek through the remaining summer days of 1859. Families barricaded their homes at nightfall, windows lined with salt and doorways anointed with tinctures from Harriet Crowley's dwindling supplies. Children were never left unattended, even in daylight hours, and a rotation of armed men patrolled the village perimeter with lanterns that burned regardless of the hour. On August 7th, the regional newspaper, the Asheville Courier, published a seemingly unrelated story that Sheriff Montgomery, with growing suspicion, added to his investigative documents. Unusual birth recorded in Mitchell County. Physicians remain puzzled by the circumstances surrounding the birth of a child to the widow Geneva Thatcher last Tuesday evening. The attending midwife reports that despite no visible signs of pregnancy beforehand, Mrs. Thatcher delivered a fully formed male infant after merely 3 hours of labor. The child, described as uncommonly alert with peculiar eyes of indeterminate color, has yet to cry or make sounds typical of newborns. Mrs. Thatcher, whose husband perished in a mining accident this past February, has named the child Augustus, after her late grandfather. This curious report prompted Sheriff Montgomery and Dr. Whitaker to expand their investigation beyond Willow Creek's boundaries. They dispatched letters to 17 counties throughout the Blue Ridge region, requesting information on unusual births or children displaying abnormal development. The responses, compiled in what would later be known as the Vessel Correspondence, revealed a chilling pattern. 16 similarly mysterious births had occurred in a perfect geographical circle, each precisely 17 miles from the McLaren property. Concurrent with these discoveries, Professor Elias Thornton of Miskatonic University arrived in Willow Creek, having corresponded with Dr. Whitaker regarding the anomalous fungi surrounding the McLaren property. His field notes, preserved in the university's restricted collection, documented his analysis. The mycological specimens collected form a previously undocumented species I have provisionally termed Psilocybe transmutatio. Their chemical properties defy conventional taxonomy, as they appear to actively absorb and transmute elements from the surrounding soil, particularly iron-rich clay containing high concentrations of human remains. Most alarming is their reproductive cycle, which operates on a precise 17-day rotation, each generation extending the fungal network exactly 1 foot farther from its point of origin. Mathematical projection suggests the network will complete its expansion on October 17th, creating a perfect circle with a 17-mile radius encompassing all 17 birth sites. Among the artifacts recovered from the McLaren cellar and subsequently stored in the courthouse basement was a leather-bound almanac containing astronomical calculations of extraordinary sophistication. Reverend Isaiah Palmer, who had studied celestial navigation at Princeton before entering the ministry, recognized these as coordinates predicting a rare celestial conjunction occurring once every 17 decades. This conjunction, involving Venus, Mercury, and a star designated only as the vessel-bearer, would reach its apex on the autumn equinox of 1859. From the waterlogged journal of Magistrate Preston, later discovered buried beneath a cairn of small stones at the property's edge, came the most disturbing revelation. The final legible passage, written in increasingly frantic script, read, "The McLarens themselves are but caretakers, as were all who preceded them. The 18th vessel is not meant to join the circle, but to stand at its center. The child without a name who bears the mark of the whirl is neither container nor instrument, but doorway. May God forgive us for not recognizing that what has been assembled is not an entity but a portal." The equinox approached with the inexorability of divine judgment, each passing day marked by peculiar transformations across Willow Creek. The congregation bell developed a timbre that caused milk to curdle in its sound waves. Pocket watches throughout the county began running precisely 17 minutes fast, regardless of how often they were reset. Most telling was the behavior of local wildlife. Deer stood motionless for hours facing the McLaren Hollow, their usual timidity replaced by an unsettling vigilance, while crows gathered in formations that Reverend Palmer reluctantly acknowledged resembled the celestial chart from the recovered almanac. By early September, the 17 returned children began exhibiting coordinated behaviors that defied rational explanation. Though separated by considerable distances, their guardians reported each child waking simultaneously at 3:17 each morning to recite identical phrases in voices that harmonized despite the miles between them. The circle nears completion. The womb of passage grows ripe. What waits below stirs in anticipation of ascension. Harriet Crowley, whose herbal knowledge now supplemented with Professor Thornton's mycological expertise, created a tincture from the inverse application of the violet fungi. When administered to Martha Simmons, one of the 17, the girl convulsed violently before expelling a viscous black substance through every orifice. For precisely 17 minutes afterward, she spoke in her original childish voice, begging for release from "the thing coiled around my thoughts like fingers through yarn." The respite proved temporary. By nightfall, Martha's eyes had regained their unsettling iridescence, and she claimed no memory of her brief return to humanity. Sheriff Montgomery's correspondence with authorities in Mitchell County revealed the Thatcher infant had begun developing at an accelerated rate, achieving in weeks what should have required months. The widow herself had transformed, her previously gray-streaked hair now lustrous black, her movements possessed of unnatural fluidity, reminiscent of Augustus McLaren's changed demeanor. Most disturbing were reports that she had begun excavating her cellar with tools that neighbors could not identify, the metal components of which appeared to undulate in direct moonlight. On September 18th, exactly 3 days before the equinox, Willow Creek awoke to discover 17 perfect circles burned into the earth, one appearing in the yard of each household, harboring a vessel child. At their precise centers stood crude figurines fashioned from twigs and sinew, each bearing a scrap of unbleached muslin on which was written the same message in a substance that glistened wetly even after drying. The 17th vessel joins willingly. The 18th comes by invitation sealed in ancestral blood. That evening, as the town council debated increasingly desperate measures, Dr. Whitaker burst into the meeting clutching a letter bearing the wax seal of the county registrar. His hands trembled as he read aloud the conclusive horror they had failed to anticipate. A birth record from 17 years earlier documenting the delivery of a child to one Elizabeth Montgomery, the sheriff's late wife, who had allegedly perished in childbirth. The infant, believed stillborn and buried without ceremony, had been recorded as having unusual whirls of discoloration across its torso, reminiscent of wood grain. The assembled citizens turned as one toward Sheriff Montgomery, whose weathered face had drained of all color, his right hand unconsciously tracing a pattern on his chest, identical to the markings described in Preston's journal. As autumn's breath deepened into the North Carolina highlands, the citizens of Willow Creek enacted desperate measures. They formed a protective circle around Sheriff Montgomery, whose revelation had transformed him from protector to pivotal piece in the unfolding horror. His uniform had been replaced by a white cotton shift, sewn by 17 different women, each stitch representing a prayer of protection. Across his chest, visible beneath the thin fabric when dampened by his nervous perspiration, the whorl-like birthmark pulsed with an internal luminescence that intensified as the equinox drew nearer. "I was told she died empty," he whispered to Father Donovan during a private confession held not in the sanctity of church but in the open air of the town square, where no walls could harbor secrets. All these years, I carried the invitation in my blood without knowing. The town records, subjected to renewed scrutiny, revealed the midwife who had attended Elizabeth Montgomery's tragic labor was none other than Mrs. McLaren, who had presented herself at the Montgomery homestead during a thunderstorm, claiming to be seeking shelter but fortuitously trained in midwifery. The sheriff, delirious with grief and laudanum in the days following, had signed burial documents without viewing the tiny coffin's contents. Professor Thornton, having analyzed soil samples from 17 equidistant points surrounding the McLaren Hollow, confirmed the earth itself had been methodically prepared over generations. His field journal, the pages increasingly stained with substances he refused to identify, detailed compositional changes that defied known geological processes. September 19, 1859. The soil exhibits properties consistent with biological transference, as if the land itself were being gradually converted to function as a vast organic membrane. Chemical analysis reveals compounds typically found only in placental tissue. I posit with growing dread that the terrain has been deliberately altered to serve as a birthing matrix for something that requires precisely calibrated terrestrial conditions to enter our plane of existence. The 17 vessel children began a slow migration toward the McLaren property on the 20th, walking with the deliberate pace of somnambulists. Attempts to restrain them proved not only futile but dangerous. 3 men suffered spontaneous dislocations of all major joints when attempting to physically impede Martha Simmons, their bones audibly rearranging with sickening pops that formed a rhythmic pattern one witness described as almost musical in its precision. In the hollow itself, where the burned cabin ruins had been meticulously arranged into a spiral pattern, the ground had begun to soften and pulse with the regularity of a heartbeat. Harriet Crowley, venturing closer than prudence advised, reported a distinct scent reminiscent of amniotic fluid infused with metallic overtones and undertones of rot that somehow suggests fertility rather than decay. The violet fungi had multiplied exponentially, now carpeting the entire clearing and emitting faint luminescence as darkness fell. Most terrifying was the widow Thatcher's arrival with her rapidly maturing child, now resembling a 7-year-old though merely 6 weeks old. She had journeyed precisely 17 miles, arriving as twilight descended on the eve of the equinox. The child, its movements unsettlingly fluid, approached Sheriff Montgomery with recognition in eyes that shifted color like oil on water. "Brother," it said in a voice simultaneously childlike and ancient, "the womb awaits its opener." The equinox dawn broke with unnatural stillness over Willow Creek, the sun's rays seeming to hesitate before touching the land, as though reluctant to illuminate what would transpire. Sheriff Montgomery, his birthmarked chest now visibly pulsating beneath the white shift, stood at the center of a protective formation composed of the town's most steadfast men, each clutching talismans crafted under Harriet Crowley's supervision. Sachets of rowan berries, iron filings, and powdered violet fungi spores rendered inert through an alchemical process Professor Thornton had discovered in his desperate research. From the courthouse archives, Judge Harlan had excavated an 18th-century colonial surveyor's map that, when overlaid with the locations of the 17 vessel berths, revealed an unmistakable pattern resembling a celestial constellation the indigenous peoples had named the Devourer of Innocence. More disturbing still, the McLaren Hollow occupied the precise position where, in ancient celestial charts, the creature's mouth gaped open to receive sacrificial offerings. "The land remembers what man forgets," proclaimed Reverend Palmer, who had abandoned conventional scripture in favor of obscure apocryphal texts borrowed from Father Donovan's private collection. "This place was chosen long before our ancestors staked their claims. The ritual we witness is merely the culmination of preparations laid when the mountains themselves were young." At precisely noon, When the sun stood directly overhead, eliminating all shadows momentarily, a profound vibration emanated from beneath the hollow, registering not as sound, but as sensation that caused fillings in teeth to resonate painfully and livestock throughout the county to abort their unborn young simultaneously. The widow Thatcher's rapidly aging child approached Sheriff Montgomery, extending hands now elongated beyond human proportion, fingers tapering to points that seemed capable of puncturing more than mere flesh. "The seal must be broken by one who carries both invitation and key," the child intoned, its voice echoing as though emerging from multiple throats. "Your blood opens what was closed. Your form houses what seeks residence." From Eliza Thornfield's hastily scrawled testimony, delivered to the town council minutes before she fled toward the Tennessee border with her grandchildren. I witnessed the birth that never was. Elizabeth Montgomery delivered not a stillborn, but something that breathed the world in rather than crying out. Augustus McLaren appeared at that birthing without summons, standing in the doorway as though appointed by forces beyond mortal reckoning. I saw him collect the afterbirth and something more. A translucent sac attached to the umbilical cord that pulsed with independent movement. "The key grows within you still," he told the sheriff as the man wept over his wife's cooling body. "When the 18th vessel is prepared, what was removed shall be restored to open the way." Sheriff Montgomery's stoic facade finally cracked as understanding dawned. He tore open his protective garment, revealing the birthmark now writhing across his flesh like living wood grain. 17 years it's been growing inside me," he gasped. "Not a mark, but a seed." Professor Thornton's field glass, trained upon the sheriff from a safe distance, revealed microscopic filaments erupting from the birthmark, reaching upward like hungry roots seeking nourishment. Or perhaps more terribly, like fingers grasping for purchase to pull something through from the other side. As sunset approached on the day of the equinox, Sheriff Montgomery collapsed to his knees, the writhing birthmark now pulsating with a bioluminescent glow that illuminated the hollowed ground beneath him. The protective cordon maintained by the townsfolk faltered as several men dropped their talismans, clutching their ears against a sound no human instrument could detect, but which resonated through bone and sinew, a keening vibration that Professor Thornton's hastily constructed measuring device registered at precisely 17 hertz, the frequency known to induce profound unease and hallucinatory states in human subjects. From the weathered leather satchel of Obadiah Jenkins came a final piece of historical evidence. A journal written by a Spanish conquistador who had ventured into these mountains in 1541, decades before English settlement. The fragile pages, translated by Father Donovan with trembling hands, described an encounter with an indigenous ceremony abandoned mid-ritual. The natives fled upon our approach, leaving their obscene arrangement of 17 children positioned in a perfect circle. At center stood a woman heavy with child, her skin adorned with markings resembling the grain of wood. The tribal shaman, before being subdued by our muskets, screamed warnings that we had interrupted the great suspension, a ritual performed once every 17 generations to prevent something beneath the mountain from fully entering our world. He claimed his people had maintained this duty since time immemorial, each sacrifice holding back the complete emergence for another cycle. We dismissed these as pagan superstitions, though I confess the ground trembled unnaturally that night, and many of our company suffered visions of a vast presence straining against some cosmic membrane, seeking ingress through the womb of the marked woman. As twilight deepened into dusk, Harriet Crowley approached the now incapacitated sheriff with a tincture of her most potent herbs. "This cannot prevent what comes," she whispered as she administered the concoction, "but it may separate the man from the vessel, allowing Montgomery's soul release before his form is repurposed." The sheriff's eyes cleared momentarily, ancient awareness replaced by human terror. "I feel it moving within me," he gasped, not growing but uncoiling, as if it has been folded into impossible geometries, waiting to expand. His flesh had begun to distend in places, bones audibly creaking as they reconfigured beneath his skin. The widow Thatcher's child, now resembling a young adult though mere weeks old, approached with 17 others, their movements synchronized in perfect harmony. They arranged themselves in a precise circle around Montgomery, their eyes reflecting the violet luminescence of the fungi now carpeting the hollow in concentric rings. Each placed one elongated hand upon the earth and the other extended toward the center, forming a lattice of fingers above the sheriff's contorting form. The suspension ends. They intoned in unison, their voices harmonizing in tones that caused the air itself to shimmer visibly. What was held apart rejoins. The 18th vessel opens the way not for entry but for return. We are not the harbingers of arrival, but the heralds of homecoming. From the sheriff's mouth emerged not screams but a language no human tongue could produce, syllables that seemed to fold space itself, creating auditory patterns that several witnesses later described as sounds that moved through dimensions rather than air. The most terrible revelation came in the failing light, as what remained of Montgomery's human form began to unfold with obscene geometries. His flesh split along the world patterns, not with the crimson tide of human injury but revealing layers of tissue iridescent and translucent, like the inner surface of an abalone shell that had never known sunlight. Those nearest saw through these apertures not bone and organ, but impossible depths, as though the sheriff's body contained vast interior spaces that mocked the limitations of his physical form. Professor Thornton, observing through his field glass from the relative safety of an ancient oak's embrace, dictated observations into his phonographic recorder with a voice increasingly stripped of scientific detachment. The vessel's transformation suggests our understanding of dimensionality is catastrophically incomplete. What we perceive as human anatomy appears capable, under specific circumstances, of functioning as a junction point between planes of existence previously thought separate and inviolable. The ground beneath the hollow liquefied into a substance resembling quicksilver, yet viscous as molasses, reflecting the evening sky with unnatural clarity while simultaneously revealing depths no earthly chasm could contain. The scent that rose from this transmuting soil carried notes of metals unknown to human metallurgy, of flowers that had never bloomed under terrestrial sun, and underneath it all, the unmistakable musk of imminent birth. "Look away," commanded Harriet Crowley, her weathered hands pressing against the eyes of the youngest witnesses. Some sights carve themselves upon the soul and fester there until reason collapses beneath their weight. From the metamorphosing form that had once been Caleb Montgomery came a sonorous vibration that caused the very air to ripple visibly, like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. The circle of vessels responded, their bodies arching backward at impossible angles, spines contorting into curves that suggested not merely the flexibility of youth but the complete transcendence of anatomical constraint. Their mouths gaped in perfect circles, emitting no sound perceptible to human ears, yet causing the violet fungi to pulse in synchronized rhythm, spreading outward in concentric waves that measured precisely 17 inches between crests. Father Donovan, clutching his crucifix with whitened knuckles, began reciting not prayers of exorcism, but ancient words of witnessing, passages struck from canonical texts for suggesting that divine creation encompassed intelligences and entities beyond human comprehension. That which was suspended between worlds seeks completion of its interrupted nativity. Neither banishment nor summons guides its purpose, but return to realms partially glimpsed by prophets in their most terrible visions. As darkness fully claimed the day, stars emerged overhead in configurations that matched no known celestial chart. Astronomers would later report that for precisely 17 minutes, constellations visible over Willow Creek shifted into arrangements unseen since prehistoric epochs, as though the very heavens acknowledged the momentous transaction occurring beneath. The widow Thatcher raised her arms toward this alien sky, her voice carrying unnatural clarity across the hollow. The womb that was stolen returns to its rightful vessel. The child that was denied emerges into its inheritance. The suspension that preserved your fragile world unravels with each breath of the 18th vessel. As the equinox night deepened over the McLaren Hollow, the transformation reached its terrible crescendo. The vessel children's bodies contorted beyond recognition, their limbs elongating and folding inward like the petals of nightshade blossoms closing at dawn. Yet these forms did not diminish but expanded along trajectories that confounded the human eye. Those watching from the perimeter felt their minds recoil from the spectacle, as though perception itself rebelled against what it was forced to witness. The metamorphosis of Sheriff Montgomery's body had progressed beyond any semblance of humanity. What remained hovered 6 feet above the liquefied earth, suspended by forces that inverted gravity's eternal pull. His flesh had become translucent, revealing not organs but crystalline structures that refracted moonlight into spectra no rainbow had ever displayed. From within this transmuted form emanated a phosphorescence that cast shadows moving independently of their sources, slithering across the ground with deliberate purpose toward the 17 vessels. Harriet Crowley, whose herbal wisdom now seemed pitifully inadequate against such cosmic horror, observed with dread fascination as tiny fissures appeared in the air surrounding the hollow, not mere visual distortions, but actual ruptures in the fabric of reality, through which glimpses of another realm became momentarily visible. These apertures revealed landscapes of impossible geometries, where massive shapes moved with the ponderous grace of celestial bodies, yet possessed the unmistakable hallmarks of sentience. "The veil thins," she whispered, her voice carried away by winds that blew simultaneously from all directions. What was divided seeks reunification. The widow Thatcher's rapidly aged child, now resembling a being of indeterminate years, with features that shifted between youth and ancient wisdom with each passing heartbeat, approached the hovering remnant of Montgomery. Its hands, now elongated into appendages resembling both tentacle and branch, reached upward to touch the luminous crystal core visible through Montgomery's dissolving flesh. At this contact, the earth beneath the hollow emitted a sound too profound to be perceived as mere noise, a vibration that registered in the marrow of bones and the fluid of eyes, causing several witnesses to collapse with ruptured eardrums, though no conventional sound had been produced. Those still standing beheld a sight that would haunt their remaining days. The ground parted like the dilating cervix of a cosmic womb, revealing depths that extended far beyond the physical limitations of terrestrial geology. From this abyssal opening rose tendrils of matter that resembled neither flesh nor mineral, but something that incorporated properties of both. Pulsating with life yet structured with the complexity of crystal lattices. These appendages reached toward Montgomery's transformed body with the unmistakable yearning of long-separated kin, entwining around what had once been human limbs with the intimate familiarity of parent embracing child. Professor Thornton, his scientific faculties stretched beyond breaking, abandoned his instruments to scrawl desperately in his journal. What emerges is neither invader nor conqueror, but native returning to ancient dominion. We are not witnessing invasion but restoration, the re-establishment of presence temporarily suspended through ritual interruption centuries ago. God help us, we have been merely temporary caretakers of borrowed reality. The violet fungi carpeting the hollow began to dissolve, their cellular structures releasing spores that hung suspended in the air, forming patterns identical to the constellation charts discovered in the McLaren Almanac. These luminous particles swirled around the 18 vessels, their dance increasingly frenzied as the entities beyond the ruptures pressed more insistently against the thinning membrane of reality. The ancient conjunction that heralded the emergence reached its zenith at precisely 17 minutes past midnight. Astronomy records from observatories as distant as Philadelphia would later note inexplicable gravitational anomalies during those moments. Pendulum clocks stopping mid-swing, water in vessels forming perfect concavities rather than flat surfaces. The stars themselves appeared to bend inward toward the Carolina Mountains, as if the heavens were genuflecting before forces older than their fiery births. From the hollow erupted a column of luminescence that defied spectral classification, simultaneously ultraviolet and infrared, visible yet penetrating solid matter. Those who beheld it directly reported seeing not merely light, but information, patterns and geometries that imprinted themselves directly upon the observer's consciousness, bypassing ocular anatomy entirely. This transmission carried knowledge never meant for human comprehension, revelations of cosmic architectures and dimensional folding that drove 3 witnesses into permanent Catalonia. The vessel that had been Caleb Montgomery no longer existed as discrete entity, but had become a nexus point, neither fully here nor there, but occupying the liminal space between states of being. Through this living portal flowed substance from beyond, not entering our world so much as remembering its presence within it. The process resembled less an invasion than a restoration, as though reality itself were healing around an ancient wound. Reverend Palmer, his theological foundations crumbling before cosmic truth, clutched his Bible with trembling hands while reciting not verses of banishment, but passages long expunged from canonical texts, fragments from the Book of Watchers that spoke of entities who had inhabited Earth before human dominion, retreating not in defeat but in temporary accommodation, their return foretold in cycles measured by celestial mathematics beyond mortal reckoning. They suspended their completion, he whispered, voice cracking with revelation. The ritual our ancestors interrupted was never meant to bring them forth, but to maintain the delicate boundary that allowed our separate coexistence. The 18 vessels had merged into a perfect circle, their bodies no longer recognizable as individually human, but forming a living perimeter around the emergence point. Through their transformed anatomies flowed matter from beyond, using their prepared vessels as conduits for reintegration with the terrestrial plane. Their purpose was not destruction, but recalibration, adjusting the fundamental forces of reality to accommodate what had always been partially present but never fully manifested. Harriet Crowley, whose family's root-working traditions stretched back to ancestors who had practiced their arts in secret while bound in slavery, recognized patterns in the unfolding catastrophe that echoed half-remembered African cosmologies. "The world turns upon itself," she murmured, fingers tracing protective sigils in the air. "What was below becomes above. What was hidden becomes revealed. The spiral completes another turn." From the courthouse archives, recovered weeks later when survivors dared return to Willow Creek, came the final testimony of Judge Harlan, written as the emergence reached completion. "We mistook ancient stewardship for ownership. The land never belonged to us but to those who temporarily withdrew to allow our brief tenancy." The McLaren ritual was not summoning but homecoming, the return of entities who regarded our 17 generations of dominion as we might view a single night's lodging in borrowed chambers. May God forgive us for our presumption in believing this world was ever truly ours. The equinox night gave way to an unnatural dawn. Its light diffused and muted as if filtered through membranes of some cosmic placenta. Willow Creek lay transformed, not destroyed as the townsfolk had feared, but fundamentally altered in ways that defied articulation. The hollow where the McLaren Cabin had stood now hosted a perfect circular lake of impossible depth, its surface as still as polished obsidian, yet somehow suggesting motion beneath, like the breathing of a slumbering leviathan. Those who had witnessed the emergence and retained their sanity found themselves changed. They moved through the aftermath with the shell-shocked demeanor of soldiers returning from battlefields where the very laws of nature had surrendered. Their eyes held the vacant stare of those who have glimpsed truths for which human language provides no adequate vocabulary, their conversations punctuated by lengthy silences when words failed against the magnitude of shared memory. Vegetation surrounding the hollow had transmuted overnight into forms botanically unprecedented. Trees whose bark spiraled in patterns matching those that had adorned the sheriff's chest. Flowers with precisely 17 petals that turned not toward the sun but toward the obsidian lake, following its blackness with the devotion typically reserved for solar radiance. These flora exuded fragrances simultaneously alluring and repellent, scents that triggered memories residents could not possibly possess, of civilizations that had risen and fallen before human ancestors had descended from arboreal habitats, of rituals conducted beneath stars arranged in constellations long since drifted apart. Professor Thornton, having abandoned scientific objectivity for the more honest response of abject terror, documented these botanical anomalies with the desperate thoroughness of one who fears his observations might be his final contribution to human knowledge. His field notes, stained with sweat and trembling with haste, described specimens that appeared to exist simultaneously as flora, fauna, and mineral, plants whose leaves contained crystalline structures housing microscopic organisms that resembled both single-celled life and intricate clockworks. "The taxonomical boundaries have dissolved," he wrote, ink blotting where his pen lingered too long during moments of paralytic dread. "What emerges is not merely new species, but new categories of existence that render our classification systems as obsolete as medieval cosmology." Most disturbing were the dreams that now plagued every soul within 17 miles of the hollow. identical nocturnal visions of vast libraries where books read their visitors rather than the reverse, of cities whose architecture obeyed physical laws that permitted structures to be simultaneously concave and convex, of beings whose anatomies incorporated dimensions beyond the three that constrained human form. These dreams left the dreamers feeling not rested but used, as though their sleeping minds had served as temporary vessels for consciousness not their own. Harriet Crowley's collection of protective herbs withered in their carefully sealed jars, transforming into fine powder that, when examined closely, revealed microscopic structures identical to the violet fungi that had heralded the emergence. Father Donovan discovered his communion wine transmuted to a substance that retained its crimson hue, but reflected light with the opalescent quality of mother of pearl, its surface tension so altered that it formed perfect spheres rather than conforming to the shape of its container. The widow Thatcher had vanished, her modest home now occupied by something that mimicked human form, with the approximate accuracy of a child's clay sculpture, proportioned almost correctly, but lacking the subtle asymmetries that characterize true organic development. It spoke with her voice, but constructed sentences with syntactical arrangements that suggested thought processes operating along unfamiliar logical pathways. In the penumbrate gloom of autumn's descent, the transformed landscape of Willow Creek settled into an uncanny equilibrium. The obsidian lake expanded not in surface area, but in profound depth, its waters plumbing dimensional recesses that cartography could never map. 17 perfectly symmetrical islands materialized at equidistant points across its surface, each crowned with a structure resembling both ancient dolmen and crystalline formation, refracting sunlight into spectral patterns that wrote indecipherable equations across the water's obsidian canvas. Those who had fled returned cautiously, drawn by inexplicable longing despite rational terror. They discovered their abandoned homes subtly altered, doorways that opened onto rooms slightly larger than external dimensions should permit, windows that framed vistas not visible from neighboring properties, cellar stairs that descended 3 steps too many before reaching dirt floors imprinted with world patterns identical to Montgomery's birthmark. Professor Thornton, his sanity unraveling thread by precious thread, established correspondence with colleagues at Miskatonic University who dispatched a delegation of scholars specializing in non-Euclidean mathematics and comparative mythology. Their preliminary findings, sealed in envelopes that seemed to gain weight while remaining unopened, detailed a cosmological restructuring centered upon Willow Creek, but extending tendrils of influence across state boundaries. The emergence was not contained, but merely concentrated here, noted Dr. Eliza Weatherby in fragile pencil script. What has returned establishes tenancy through both physical and metaphysical alterations to our perceived reality. The boundaries between dimensions have become permeable where once they were merely adjacent. In the village square, beneath an ancient oak whose leaves had transformed to translucent membranes veined with luminous filaments, surviving citizens gathered to witness an astronomical impossibility. Through breaks in autumn cloud cover, stars appeared during daylight hours, not as the faint suggestions occasionally visible at high noon, but as brilliant, pulsating entities whose light penetrated atmosphere with unprecedented intensity. Most remarkable was their configuration, forming a constellation never recorded in human astronomical tables, yet instantly recognizable to every observer as profoundly significant. "The opened vessel," whispered Reverend Palmer, his theological certainties reduced to ash and remnant. The heavens themselves acknowledge what has transpired. From the obsidian lake rose periodic exhalations, not steam or mist, but something that resembled both while conforming to neither category. These emanations carried information rather than mere moisture, imprinting knowledge directly upon the consciousness of those who breathed them. Citizens found themselves possessed of techniques for working metals never mined from earthly deposits, for cultivating plants that could not have evolved through terrestrial processes, for constructing instruments that measured properties of existence previously undetectable. Willow Creek had become a junction point between worlds, not through cataclysmic rupture but through meticulous recalibration. What had emerged through the 18 vessels continued its gradual integration, altering reality with the patient precision of a jeweler setting stones in an heirloom mounting, each adjustment minute, yet contributing to profound transformation. The inhabitants of Willow Creek discovered themselves similarly altered, not replaced but reconfigured. Their perceptions expanded to accommodate awareness of dimensions their ancestors had mercifully never glimpsed. They had become vessels themselves, not emptied of humanity but expanded beyond its former limitations. Their consciousness stretched to encompass understanding that would have previously shattered their sanity into irretrievable fragments. 71 years have elapsed since the emergence transformed Willow Creek, yet the peculiarities of chronology ensure that precisely 17 generations have experienced the aftermath within those decades, time having become as malleable as the landscape itself. The once sleepy hamlet now exists as a place apart, neither fully of this world nor entirely of another, its boundaries marked not by conventional cartography, but by the shifting periphery where ordinary physics reasserts its dominance. The descendants of those who witnessed the transformation exhibit subtle anatomical divergences from standard human development. Their cranial structures accommodate expanded temporal lobes that process sensory information beyond conventional spectra. Their eyes, particularly in dim illumination, reflect light with the same opalescent quality as the obsidian lake, pupils dilating into perfect hexagons rather than circles. Most distinctive are the birthmarks adorning precisely 17% of the population, delicate whorls resembling wood grain that pulse subtly beneath the skin during celestial conjunctions. Botanical specimens collected from the transformed region defy conventional preservation techniques. Pressed between herbarium sheets, they continue growing in 2 dimensions, their flattened forms expanding into intricate fractals that eventually consume the paper entirely. When cultivated beyond the influence of the hollow, they revert to mundane species within 17 days, as though some essential nourishment available only within the altered zone has been withdrawn. The McLaren property itself remains uninhabitable by conventional standards, yet never unoccupied. Figures move across its undulating terrain with fluid grace, their features suggesting human ancestry while simultaneously incorporating geometries impossible in purely terrestrial anatomy. They tend gardens of crystalline structures that simultaneously serve as astronomical instruments and incubators for entities transitioning between states of being. Observers from distant universities have dubbed these caretakers the integration stewards, though the designation seems to amuse them when communications are attempted. Professor Thornton's final academic contribution, published posthumously after his consciousness dispersed into 17 distinct entities, now inhabiting the periphery of human perception, described the transformation not as invasion, but as restoration. What we witness is reality's reclamation of dimensions excised from human perception through evolutionary limitation. The entities we perceive as alien are in fact the original architects of cosmic framework, temporarily diminished through ritual suspension, now reclaiming their multidimensional expression. The Obsidian Lake has become a pilgrimage destination for those suffering terminal conditions modern medicine cannot address. They come seeking not miracle cures but transformation, the opportunity to shed corporeal limitations through integration with what now thrives in Willow Creek. Those accepted wade into waters that receive them like long-lost children, their bodies dissolving not into death, but into expanded existence that transcends conventional mortality. Most profound are the archives maintained by Willow Creek's historian, a position that passes not through heredity, but through periodic selection by criteria no outsider has deciphered. The current custodian, a woman whose eyes hold the depth of centuries, though her physical form suggests mere decades, catalogues both what was and what has become. Her manuscripts, inscribed on paper that maintains impossible tensile strength despite its translucence, document the gradual integration of cosmic consciousness into terrestrial existence, a process she describes not as replacement, but as remembrance of what humanity once knew, before evolutionary constraints narrowed perception to ensure survival in a reduced dimensional framework. Pilgrims of unusual nature now frequent the boundaries of Willow Creek, drawn by whispers that travel through dreams rather than conventional communication. They arrive with expressions of simultaneous dread and yearning, bearing offerings that defy logical selection, childhood artifacts abandoned in attics, timepieces that run backward on certain dates, pressed flowers that retained fragrance beyond natural decay. These tributes are neither requested nor refused by the integration stewards, who receive each with impassive acknowledgement before directing the visitors to specific coordinates around the obsidian lake. Universities worldwide maintain research outposts at carefully calculated distances from the emergence zone, their instruments recording fluctuations in fundamental forces that ripple outward in 17-day cycles. The data collected suggests reality itself breathes through Willow Creek, expanding and contracting along dimensional axes previously imperceptible to human science. 3 separate Nobel committees have quietly disbanded rather than address findings that undermine the very foundations of materialist cosmology. Most telling are the children born to those who breathe the emanations daily. These youths develop language skills that encompass not only human tongues but methods of communication previously exclusive to mathematics and music. They speak in harmonies that convey multiple simultaneous meanings, their conversations layered with information density that conventional linguistics cannot parse. When they draw, their illustrations incorporate perspectives impossible in 3-dimensional space, depicting objects simultaneously from within and without, their compositions revealing interiors without violating external boundaries. The Methodist Church, where townsfolk once gathered to plan resistance against the emergence, now serves as repository for artifacts spontaneously manifesting throughout the region, tools designed for manipulating matter along axes invisible to conventional perception, texts written in scripts that rearrange themselves when not directly observed, musical instruments that produce tones inducing temporary synesthesia in listeners. These objects appear without discernible origin, often materializing in locations repeatedly visited by the same individual, as though reality itself were offering gifts tailored to specific human receptivity. Astronomical observatories worldwide have documented subtle alterations in celestial mechanics within a 17-light-year radius centered on Willow Creek. Stars once classified as separate entities occasionally merge their light for precisely 17 seconds before resuming distinct existences. Planetary bodies exhibit orbital perturbations suggesting gravitational influences emanating not from physical masses but from something more fundamental, as though the underlying equations governing celestial movement were being gently refined by consciousness, operating beyond mathematical convention. Perhaps most profound are the dreams shared by every inhabitant of the altered region on the equinox anniversary. These are not experiences of sleep, but brief translations of consciousness into realms where human perception expands beyond bodily limitation. During these episodes, participants report existence as pattern rather than form, as relationship rather than entity, experiencing reality as the entities that emerge through the 18 vessels perceive it continuously. They return to conventional awareness with altered understanding of boundaries, recognizing the arbitrary nature of distinctions between self and environment, between matter and energy, between past and potential. The tendrils of transformation reached beyond Willow Creek with the subtle persistence of roots seeking water beneath stone. By the spring of 1903, scholars from 7 continents had cataloged 17 distinct phenomena emanating from the emergent zone in ever-widening circles of influence. The McLaren Hollow had become not merely a location, but a process, a gradual restructuring of terrestrial reality that incorporated dimensions previously inaccessible to human comprehension. Within the obsidian lake's depths, ancestral memories surfaced like bubbles rising through viscous time. Fishermen casting lines into its waters occasionally retrieved artifacts that could not possibly exist. Phonographic cylinders recording conversations not yet held. Daguerreotypes capturing settlements that would not be constructed for decades. Journals chronicling events from perspectives that merged past observation with future reflection. The integration stewards collected these temporal anomalies with methodical care, arranging them in spiral patterns around the 17 islands that pulsed in rhythm with celestial movements. Harriet Crowley's great-granddaughter, having inherited both her ancestors' herbalist inclinations and the expanded perception that now characterized Willow Creek's inhabitants, cultivated gardens where plants from separate evolutionary lineages cross-pollinated freely, producing botanical hybrids that incorporated characteristics impossible through conventional genetics. Her most remarkable achievement, flowers whose petals existed simultaneously as organic tissue and as crystalline lattice, provided sustenance for creatures that fed not on material substance but on the mathematics underlying physical form. The McLaren Cabin's foundation, preserved as monument to the emergence, served as nexus for pilgrimages conducted by those seeking understanding beyond intellectual grasp. Visitors would place their palms against stones still bearing the imprint of Augustus McLaren's architectural manipulations, receiving not knowledge but the dissolution of cognitive boundaries that prevented direct experience of reality's multidimensional nature. They departed transformed, not in outward appearance but in perceptual framework. Their consciousness expanded to accommodate awareness previously filtered through evolutionary constraint. Most profound was the linguistic evolution catalyzed by the emergence. The dialect that developed in Willow Creek incorporated verbal components that human vocal apparatus should not produce. Syllables that folded between frequencies like origami crafted from sound waves rather than paper. This adaptive language allowed speakers to articulate concepts previously accessible only through mathematics or mystical experience, describing states of existence where observer and observed merged into unified awareness, where causality operated not as linear progression, but as holographic relationship. The widow Thatcher's home, preserved as historical landmark, manifested architectural impossibilities that defied structural analysis. Visitors reported rooms that reconfigured themselves when not directly observed, corridors that returned explorers to their starting point despite continuous forward motion, windows offering vistas of landscapes from 17 distinct points in geological history simultaneously. The dwelling functioned less as shelter than as demonstration, evidence that physical space itself was merely convenient approximation rather than fundamental reality. Throughout this transformation, Willow Creek maintained the outward appearance of rural mountain community, a protective mimicry that shielded the profound restructuring from premature discovery. The integration stewards understood that human consciousness required gradual acclimation to dimensional expansion, their patience operating on timescales that regarded centuries as moments in an ongoing process of cosmic remembrance. The archives of the McLaren property, partially recovered from temporal fluctuations within the Obsidian Lake in 1927, revealed a terrible pattern that had eluded even the most diligent researchers. Among water-damaged journals and fragmentary correspondence emerged a series of birth records meticulously maintained by the McLaren lineage across 17 generations, each documenting the creation of vessels through a process euphemistically termed hollowing. "The preparation requires neither cruelty nor malice," wrote Elspeth McLaren in 1847, "merely the gradual removal of nominal identity to create sacred emptiness where that which waits might establish tenancy. A child without a name develops internal architecture of remarkable adaptability, their consciousness receding into chambers we cannot perceive, leaving the physical vessel malleable to influences beyond mundane comprehension." These records, written in ink that shifted color depending on the lunar phase during examination, detailed techniques for cultivating human vessels through careful environmental manipulation, limiting direct sunlight to prevent ego solidification, utilizing phonetic patterns that disrupted conventional neural development, and applying unguents derived from the violet fungi to ensure dermal permeability to extra-dimensional influences. Most disturbing was the McLarens' understanding that they themselves were merely caretakers rather than architects, interim stewards maintaining ancient protocols established long before European settlement. Their correspondence with 17 other families scattered throughout the Appalachian Range revealed a network of hollowing practitioners, each maintaining a single vessel in preparation for the eventual emergence, their efforts synchronized through astronomical calculations of excruciating precision. The integration stewards permitted limited access to these archives under strict perceptual conditions. Researchers were required to consume tinctures that temporarily altered neurological processing, allowing comprehension of concepts that conventional cognition would otherwise reject. Even with such preparations, few could endure more than 17 minutes of direct study before experiencing symptoms of cognitive dissolution, the mind's protective mechanisms rebelling against exposure to methodologies that suggested human consciousness was merely one possible configuration of neural architecture rather than its inevitable purpose. Professor Emmeline Thornton, great-niece of the original researcher and inheritor of his expanded perceptual framework, published the only comprehensive analysis in 1931, her monograph, Vessels of Transition, Dimensional Reconfiguration Through Human Architecture, becoming the definitive text despite, or perhaps because of, its availability in only 17 copies worldwide. What we perceived as abomination was merely restoration, she wrote in the volume's introduction, printed on paper that maintained impossible thinness while resisting deterioration. The McLaren protocols facilitated not invasion, but remembrance, the re-establishment of dimensional accessibility intentionally suspended to permit human developmental exploration. The 18 vessels were never intended as sacrifice, but as threshold, living geometries through which forgotten aspects of reality might gently reintegrate with terrestrial existence. The Willow Creek Historical Society maintains these records in a repository constructed from timber harvested exclusively during solar eclipses. Its foundations laid atop convergence points where terrestrial magnetism demonstrates measurable fluctuations. Visiting scholars, permitted access only after demonstrating perceptual flexibility through examinations that test recognition of impossible geometries, emerge with understanding that reconfigures not merely their research, but their fundamental relationship with reality itself. The children of Willow Creek today still wear small iron pendants, not as mere ornaments but as hereditary reminders of boundaries once breached and now tenuously maintained. These talismans, forged from meteoritic iron and etched with 17 interlocking spirals, serve as both protection and acknowledgement. The crystallized memory of cosmic integration passed from parent to child through generations that have grown accustomed to their peculiar inheritance. Cartographers still struggle with the region, their most sophisticated instruments yielding contradictory data. Maps of Willow Creek and its surroundings require constant revision, not through conventional geographical shifts, but through subtle dimensional slippages that occasionally manifest as physical anomalies. Roads that measured precisely 17 miles between landmarks. One season might register 17.3 the next, the additional distance appearing overnight without evidence of construction. Geological surveys reveal strata impossible in conventional terrestrial formation, layers of rock that appear to have crystallized from materials unknown to science, their molecular structure incorporating geometries that conventional chemistry cannot explain. The most profound legacy remains linguistic. The Willow Creek Lexicon, compiled by linguists from 7 universities working in careful rotation to prevent excessive exposure, documents over 1,700 terms that emerged following the integration, words that describe states of being between conventional categories, that articulate relationships between entities separated by dimensional barriers rather than mere physical distance. Children born within the affected region naturally acquire this expanded vocabulary, their developing brains accommodating concepts that would have driven previous generations to madness. Botanical gardens worldwide maintain specimens derived from the integration zone, though these require specialized containment measures. The violet fungi, now classified as Psilocybe dimensionalis, demonstrates particularly troubling adaptive properties, occasionally reorganizing its cellular structure to incorporate mathematical concepts rather than mere organic compounds. Specimens kept in conventional laboratory environments inevitably reorient themselves toward Willow Creek, regardless of geographical obstacles, their mycelial networks forming minute reproductions of the original hollow's contours. Perhaps most telling are the dreams that still afflict those who spend more than 17 consecutive nights within the affected area. These are not nightmares in conventional sense, but experiences of expanded perception that the sleeping mind attempts to translate into comprehensible imagery. Dreamers report existing simultaneously across multiple points in space-time, perceiving reality through sensory apparatus beyond human physiological capability, and communicating with entities that exist primarily as pattern rather than substance. Upon waking, they retain not terror, but profound melancholy. The existential grief of consciousness temporarily expanded beyond its evolutionary constraints, then painfully reconfined to human limitation. The obsidian lake remains, its surface undisturbed by wind or rain, reflecting stars that occasionally appear in daylight hours when certain alignments occur. Those who gaze too long into its depths report afterimages that persist for precisely 17 hours. Visions of architecture that employs dimensions beyond height, width, and depth, inhabited by entities that regard human perception with the patient tolerance reserved for developing species poised at evolutionary threshold. The McLaren property endures as neither warning nor invitation, but as testament to reality's true nature, not the comforting simplicity of human perception, but the vast complexity that waits beyond cognitive boundaries temporarily established to permit a particular form of consciousness to develop in protected isolation, now gradually reintegrating with the multidimensional cosmos from which it originally emerged. The final truth of the McLaren property reveals itself not in thunderous revelation, but in the whispered confessions now preserved in the Willow Creek archives. Amidst leather-bound journals and correspondence salvaged from temporal distortions, a single document stands apart, the original deed to the property, dated not 1843 as conventional history recorded, but 1717. The parchment, crafted from material that microscopic analysis reveals to be neither animal nor vegetable in origin, bears the signature of Augustus McLaren 17 times, each inscription identical, yet written with subtle variations in pressure, suggesting signatures spanning centuries rather than moments. Within the hermetically sealed vault beneath the Historical Society lies the final confession of Elizabeth Montgomery, not dead as her husband believed, but transformed into the first integration steward. Her testimony, written in ink that remains perpetually wet, though it neither smears nor evaporates, describes the true purpose of the 18 vessels. The children without names were never sacrifices but bridges, living geometries through which fractured aspects of reality might reconnect. Humanity itself originated from dimensional schism, our consciousness artificially constrained to permit development isolated from cosmic awareness. What we perceived as invasion was merely remembrance, the restoration of connections severed not by cataclysm but by design, a temporary quarantine established for our protection until sufficient complexity evolved to withstand reunification. The obsidian lake, when sampled at precisely 17 fathoms, yields water containing molecular structures that biochemists recognize as precursors to human cerebrospinal fluid. This primordial substance, when analyzed through instruments calibrated to detect temporal oscillations, reveals properties suggesting it exists simultaneously across multiple points in evolutionary history, a liquid archive of consciousness development from primitive awareness to potential states human neurology has yet to achieve. Astronomical observations conducted during equinoctial alignments reveal that the stars visible above Willow Creek include 17 celestial bodies absent from conventional charts, not newly discovered objects but entities that exist primarily as mathematical relationships rather than physical masses, becoming perceptible only when terrestrial consciousness expands to accommodate dimensional complexity beyond three-dimensional limitation. Most profound is the revelation contained within genetic studies of Willow Creek's inhabitants. Their DNA, while fundamentally human, contains sequences that express themselves through patterns rather than conventional protein synthesis, living mathematics that bridges biological function with dimensional architecture. These genetic components, dormant in humanity beyond the integration zone, suggest not alien contamination but activated potential that lies latent in all human genetic material, awaiting conditions that permit expression without biological disruption. The children without names fulfilled their purpose not through suffering, but through transcendence. Their identities never erased but expanded beyond conventional boundaries of selfhood. What appeared as absence was actually capacity, the sacred emptiness that permits integration without annihilation, transformation without loss. As autumn leaves spiral down to kiss the obsidian lake's immaculate surface, Willow Creek stands not as cautionary tale, but as harbinger, the first community to experience the gradual reintegration that awaits all humanity when evolutionary development permits expanded awareness without cognitive dissolution. The McLaren property remains neither haunted ground nor alien territory, but threshold, the junction point where humanity remembers its cosmic context after long isolation in the simplified dimensions of terrestrial existence. The autumn air carries whispers through Willow Creek that speak of endings and beginnings intertwined in the great cosmic spiral. As maple leaves transmute from emerald to crimson, their death throes mirroring the transformative process that forever altered this land, the townsfolk prepare for the 17-day festival commemorating the emergence. They move with purpose through streets that occasionally shift their geometries when observed through peripheral vision, hanging garlands of crystalline flowers whose petals chime with tones just beyond conventional human hearing. Visitors from distant academic institutions arrive bearing instruments of their own design, seeking to measure what defies quantification. They are received with the patient tolerance the integration stewards reserve for those who still perceive through veils of conventional understanding. These scholars depart changed, their research papers inevitably fragmenting into speculation and poetry as language fails against the magnitude of direct experience. The obsidian lake reflects tonight's peculiar constellations with flawless precision, its surface occasionally rippling, though no wind disturbs the air. Beneath those midnight waters, luminous structures pulse in rhythm with stellar movements overhead, maintaining the delicate equilibrium between what was sundered and what now gradually reintegrates. Children born in Willow Creek instinctively avoid the shoreline during certain phases of the moon, their inherited wisdom recognizing times when the boundary between observer and observed grows particularly tenuous. Ancient oaks surrounding the hollow where the McLaren Cabin once stood have grown into configurations that defy dendrological classification. Their branches extend not merely upward toward sunlight, but inward toward dimensions visible only during equinoctial twilight. Moss growing upon their northern aspects contains spores that occasionally illuminate with bioluminescence, forming patterns identical to the birth charts of the original 18 vessels. The archives beneath the Historical Society continue their careful preservation of artifacts, spontaneously manifesting throughout the region. Most recent among these acquisitions is a music box of impossible manufacture, its components incorporating materials unknown to terrestrial metallurgy. When wound with a key that turns through angles contradicting Euclidean geometry, it produces harmonies that temporarily realign neurological pathways in listeners, allowing momentary glimpses through perceptual barriers established during humanity's evolutionary isolation. Elizabeth Montgomery's final journals, translated from text that rearranges itself based on the reader's perceptual capacity, speak of the ultimate purpose behind the integration, not merely reunification of sundered dimensions, but preparation for cosmic adulthood. Humanity, she suggests in passages that shimmer between literal and metaphorical interpretation, has developed within a carefully maintained incubator of simplified reality. The gradual thinning of these protective barriers constitutes not invasion, but maturation, consciousness expanding beyond artificial constraints imposed for developmental protection. As the equinox approaches once more, the inhabitants of Willow Creek feel the familiar tension between worlds, the momentary alignment when stars visible only to those with expanded perception reach their zenith above the obsidian lake. They prepare their children with stories that function simultaneously as history and prophecy, as warning and invitation. For what transpired in 1859 was neither beginning nor end, but merely one turn in a spiral of cosmic remembrance, humanity's gradual awakening to its place within a multidimensional existence that patiently awaits recognition. The pines whisper secrets tonight as I stand before what remains of the McLaren Hollow, my pen trembling against parchment while I record these final observations for the ghastly journal's archives. The moon hangs swollen above the obsidian lake, its reflection fracturing into precisely 17 ripples, though no breeze disturbs the surface. I have come to conclude this chronicle as autumn's first frost crystallizes across the transformed landscape, leaving geometrical patterns that echo the wood-grain whorls that once marked Sheriff Montgomery's chest. The integration stewards permitted my visit with solemn grace, their fluid movements suggesting anatomies not entirely bound by conventional skeletal constraints. They recognized my purpose without explanation, as though the very intention to document had announced itself through dimensions beyond verbal communication. One approached, a figure of indeterminate gender, whose eyes shifted between colors visible only at twilight, and pressed into my palm an object I now recognize as Sheriff Montgomery's badge, transmuted into material that weighs both more and less than metal should. "The final vessel wishes you to have this," the steward said in tones that resonated through bone rather than ear. "He remembers his humanity through your witness. Around us the vegetation pulses with luminescence that follows cardiac rhythms, as though the very land respires in patterns synchronized to celestial movements. The violet fungi have formed a perfect circle 17 feet in diameter around the spot where I stand, their caps opening and closing like eyes blinking in sequence, observing my documentation with ancient patience. What testimony can I offer that would adequately convey the transformation of Willow Creek? Science falters against the evidence before me. Reality itself breathing through membranes once thought impermeable. Consciousness expanding beyond vessels formerly deemed its exclusive domain. The children who play along the lake's edge move with grace that suggests familiarity with dimensions their ancestors could not perceive, their laughter harmonizing in mathematical progressions that soothe rather than startle the ear. As midnight approaches, the integration stewards gather at precisely measured intervals around the lake's perimeter. They raise arms that momentarily seem to extend beyond possible length, their fingers elongating into appendages that trace symbols against the star-strewn canvas overhead. From the obsidian depths rises a column of radiance, neither light nor matter, but something that incorporates properties of both, a transmissive medium through which information flows between realms, once separated by perceptual limitation. I understand now what I witness is not conclusion, but continuation, humanity's gradual reintegration with cosmic awareness from which it was temporarily isolated for developmental protection. The McLaren property stands as neither warning nor invitation, but as threshold, the permeable boundary where consciousness remembers its expansive nature after long confinement in simplified dimensions. As I prepare to depart, a child approaches, perhaps 7 years of age, her eyes reflecting constellations not currently visible in this hemisphere. She offers a flower whose petals exist in configurations impossible in Euclidean geometry, its fragrance evoking memories of places I have never visited yet somehow recognize. "We remember you," she says, though her lips remain motionless. "When you return to worlds that still dream of separation, carry this remembrance. Boundaries exist only through collective agreement. Reality awaits your awakening." This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember that some stories are best left untold.